Thank you, Mindy, for those kind words, and a big thank you to Cyrus and the UN Foundation for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm honored because I clearly and probably know the least of anybody in this room about the topic. But I thought what I'd do is try to bring my humble contribution from a different angle, if you will, which is to share some frontline stories of the companies we're invested in and have engaged with on the issue of climate change. So I hope these stories will illustrate to you some of the very real-world issues and challenges companies are facing in identifying feasible ways both to measure as well as mitigate climate risk. And in full disclosure, I haven't come with all the answers here today, but I'd actually like to challenge some of the thinking for us as investors about the most effective ways to work with companies and help them develop strategies to mitigate climate risk. Like all of us in this room, State Street is concerned about climate risk because we believe it poses a material financial risk to the investments we make on behalf of our clients. And we've all seen the headlines and heard about it earlier today, one of the hottest years on record, one of the costliest years for the US alone at over $300 billion in damages and losses. Let's just pause on that number for a minute. $300 billion is 50% more than the GDP of Portugal. And apart, obviously, from the horrible human toll, think about what that means in terms of value destruction. But why do we care about it at State Street? As Mindy said, we're the third largest asset manager in the world, one of the largest index managers, just a tad short of 2.8 trillion in assets under management. And we invest in over 10,000 companies listed worldwide. The indexing and ETF parts of our business in particular make us the quintessential long-term investor. We think of ourselves as providing quasi-permanent capital to these companies. We like to think that as long as a company's in the index, we own it, as we often say. So the active managers as part of State Street Global Advisors, if they don't like what a company's doing, that side of our colleagues can sell the stock. Our index managers don't have the luxury of that option. They need to fix it. We can't make the S&P 500, the S&P 499, just because we don't like what's going on. So as stewards of our clients' assets, we've deployed a very active engagement program with our portfolio companies across a wide range of environmental, social, and governance issues that might impact long-term returns. And clearly, climate-related issues have been a priority for a number of years. We've also made thinking about ESG issues, including climate, a research priority for us across our entire investment management platform as we run over $200 billion in ESG assets. And we acknowledge there's a lot of uncertainty and debate about the exact financial impact of climate change. I think if I polled all of you in this room and asked you about what the impact was going to be on New York City, or even about how many floors in this United Nations building might be underwater in 50 years, my guess is I'd get a pretty wide range of answers from you. For us, that's the textbook definition of risk. An event with a wide range of possible outcomes, some of which would be fairly dire. And it's important that as we think about and focus on climate risk, it's actually not about imposing a particular set of values on others. It's about promoting research-driven value in our investments. So what are we doing about it? So we've called on boards to consider climate change as they would any other significant risk in their business and ensure that their company's assets and long-term strategy are resilient to that change. In addition to publishing specific guidelines on the kind of analysis and reporting we'd like our portfolio companies to provide, we've also used our proxy vote to promote greater transparency around these risks. So, for example, in 2016, we were the first large investment manager to vote against company managements in support of certain shareholder proposals calling on oil, gas, and utilities companies to disclose more information on how climate change is affecting their business. And we are very pleased to see other investment managers join us in this effort. But what are the challenges? During more than 240 climate-related engagements with over 168 companies globally in the last few years, we've heard a litany of challenges that companies face in identifying and measuring the financial impact of climate risk, let alone implementing strategies to mitigate that risk. Sometimes it is about just not having the appropriate enterprise systems to capture the necessary data. But often it's not understanding how to actually implement a mitigation strategy. So let me give you an example of two companies, and these are real examples. First company, Company A, it's told by its investors it should develop a strategy to help limit the rise in global average temperature to well below the 2 degrees Celsius threshold set by the Paris Accord. Company B faced a specific goal to reduce its carbon emissions by 20% over 5 years. So show of hands, how many of you think Company A achieved its goal? Anybody? How many of you think Company B achieved its goal? Well, you guys are cynical lots. You think neither achieved their goals, okay? Well, Company A is a US oil and gas company which had no idea what actions to take to achieve its goal. It didn't know what a 2-degree warmer world would look like, or how the pace of technology improvements might change the scenarios. Board members were unsure about what kinds of metrics would best capture the impact of their decisions. Company B, on the other hand, is a Japanese manufacturer of air conditioners. And yes, for those of you who raised your hands, with a more specific emissions reduction target, the company was able to invest in R&D that ultimately led to a much more energy-efficient product. They not only reduced their overall carbon emissions significantly and met the goal, but they actually ended up with a product that's in much higher demand as consumers around the world look to more energy-efficient appliances. Now, I could make the argument and the pros and cons for each of these approaches, but I offer these up just as examples of how companies are responding in very different ways with different levels of success. So what can we learn from these examples? On the one hand, we support good faith disclosure projects underway, including the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure. And we've actually been formally endorsing that. But as we're thinking about disclosures and targets, we need to ask ourselves what the best path forward is for companies from an implementation perspective. We need to probe more deeply with our portfolio companies to understand how and why they arrive at the goals and strategies they have in place, and ensure that they have the kinds of measurement and monitoring capabilities they'll need to achieve those goals. And we should acknowledge up front, the answer might be different for different companies in different sectors. Second, we should remind ourselves that while the current focus is very much on high-impact sectors, oil, gas, utilities, and mining, and we heard a lot about that this morning. And that's understandable, but we shouldn't limit our engagement efforts to those sectors. For 2018, we're going to be expanding our stewardship focus on climate risk to sectors such as agriculture, transportation, and insurance, which obviously have major connections to climate-related change. And finally, we need to recognize that focusing solely on reducing the volume of greenhouse gases we are adding to the atmosphere is likely not going to be enough to stay within the 2-degree limit. We need to actively reduce the carbon gases that have already compromised the environment. But it's not all doom and gloom. I don't want to leave you with the thought that it's all doom and gloom. Don't underestimate the game changers happening even as I speak, and we heard about some of this in the morning sessions. India intends to sell only electric vehicles by 2030 and have had a massive expansion of solar and wind power exponentially over the next 5 years. I must confess, having grown up in India, that's a very different India than the one I grew up in. China is launching a national carbon trading program to limit pollution. Now, time will tell if these bold pronouncements are actually backed up with the appropriate actions. Of course, the other game changer is all of us in this room, right? So even if certain governments, who remain unnamed, are moving in the opposite direction, it is incumbent on investors like us, asset owners and asset managers alike, stewards of long-term value, to work with companies to bend the arc of sustainability in the right direction. Think about the global assets under management. $70 trillion. $70 trillion. That's a lot of capital firepower to put behind the climate challenge. So I say to all of us here today, let's redouble our commitment to working together to steer companies onto a path towards a cleaner, healthier, and more sustainable future. Or, as my favorite Mother Teresa quote said, "Yesterday is gone, tomorrow has not yet come. We have only today. Let us begin." Thank you.